We've known for a while, but now we really can tell that basically every disease is rare. Every disease is an N of one. Even when there's 5 patients with the disease, each one is an N of one. And our ability to do genetic sequencing and understanding the variations, not just the mutations, but the variations and how those affect disease are critical. I often say to people that we've been doing this for a while, we just have better tools. We already subdivide patients based on characteristics outside of genetics. Now we have the ability, and epigenetics, and now our ability to subdivide them further to find the best approach for each patient is less guesswork than it was.
Welcome, MedTech Gurus. Today we have a fantastic guest with us, Dr. Rob Freishtat, MD, MPH, former president and co-founder of Uncommon Cures, and current board member of the Foundation for mRNA Medicines. Dr. Freishtat spearheads the development of global, innovative clinical trial programs for rare diseases through his leadership at Uncommon Cures. Today, he leverages that experience to advise companies on innovative strategies in rare and ultra-rare conditions and applies his expertise in translational science and clinical research to advance the next generation of mRNA therapies. In rare disease, the mantra is simple but profound. Time is not money, time is lives. Dr. Freishtat helped build models where regulators act as partners, institutions collaborate across boundaries, and innovative trial designs accelerate development. This isn't just about rare disease, it's about building a durable new system for personalized medicine. Hey, Rob, are you ready to be our guru today?
Let's do it.
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah, we're very excited to have you. So tell us something fun or interesting about yourself or your family so we can get to know you a little better.
Well, I have, my wife and I have 3 sons. So our house is basically like a frat house. We've got 2 older boys who are out of school and one 14-year-old who you could say the influence of his older brothers on him is not always the best. But we have a good time and get a lot of laughs, and it's great to get away from work and be with family.
Oh yeah, there's some great ages there. That's fantastic. Sounds like a very busy household.
No doubt.
Yes. So, Rob, as president and co-founder of Uncommon Cures, you built global, innovative clinical trial programs. So I'm just kind of curious, what did you learn about trial design that the traditional pharma models often overlook? Can you provide us some insights there?
Yeah. So, trial design is an interesting historical subject. The classic randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial dates back to the World War II era and really hasn't changed much since. And when you think about it, it's obviously straightforward. We're very much used to it, and people go to it over and over and over again. The larger question is it the best choice out there? And the answer is, in most cases, no. That design is very rigid. It doesn't allow for any adjustments on the fly. Whenever you're designing a study, you design based on what you know about the disease, what you know about the drug, and you take your best guesses. But the danger, as always, is in what you don't know, right? And you learn as you go through a trial, but a standard double-blind placebo-controlled trial doesn't permit you to make adjustments along the way. Perhaps the time needed to see efficacy is longer. Perhaps you need more patients because your effect size is wrong. There's a lot of assumptions we make, and that is not a particularly adaptable design. Which brings us to adaptable designs, adaptive trials, which do incorporate those features and provide, they provide opportunities to not have to do a whole new trial because your guesses were wrong at the beginning of your first trial. And then importantly is the placebo-controlled part. Generally speaking, people who are sick and need a drug don't want a sugar pill, right? And that's especially true when you talk about diseases where the consequences are dire. So, cancer comes to mind, putting the ethics aside. And then rare disease is another one of those. You've got, you said time is lives, and I always say that. And it's true. And generally, patients don't have the luxury of being on placebo for 6 months, a year in a neurodegenerative condition. One would argue that it's not ethically sound either. So you have to come up with ways to address that concern and alleviate. And there are a bunch of options that are out there, and we advise companies to use them all the time. Natural history cohorts, so that your controls are basically being studied while you're developing the drug. Is just one example that's become quite popular. But there's lots of reasons that double-blind, placebo-controlled trials just don't work in rare, and not the least of which is you often don't have enough patients to properly power that study. And so, in general, I advise companies to look at every other option aside from that one, and only resort to that as a last resort, because there's just so many problems with it. So design, back to your original question, study design is critical. And when you look at the data out of the FDA, even in rare disease, the success rate is only about 20% at best. It's kind of dropped a little bit in the past, and that's the best at the FDA of all the different categories of diseases. So only 1 in 5 succeeds. But when you look at the failures are more likely to happen because of recruitment and retention issues as opposed to the science itself, which should never happen, right? And recruitment retention is often a result of design, of poor design, of failure to too burdensome, and in many cases, failure to get a good sense of how many patients are actually out there. When you ask five specialists, 5 KOLs in a particular area, hey, how many patients with this disease do you know? They'll say, I know 10 patients, but it turns out it's the same 10 patients.
Yeah.
Right? So you don't have 50, you got 10.
You got 10. Yeah. Interesting. So, and I want to drill into that just a little bit on a couple of things you just mentioned, right? We touched on the time is life part of it in rare disease, and also that retention piece and the study design. So as you're doing that, what operational decisions change when urgency becomes the central design principle? Can you help us with that?
Yeah, of course. So, so I just want to take a step back on that, because the urgency includes several stakeholders in a trial. So the patients, of course, are front and center. But don't forget, most of these companies that are doing rare trials are not big pharma companies that have deep pockets. These are often, single asset biotech companies. All their chips are in that basket, and they've got, 6 months, 12-month runway. So time can run out, and trials sometimes fail because the company runs out of time, right? And so urgency affects more than just the patients. So what I advise companies to do is to think about time to first patient. So what are the things that you can do to get first patient in quickly? It's an important milestone for a company. Frankly, it's an important milestone for patients. And then how do you keep those patients in? So again, reducing the burden. These are generally pretty medically burdened families, right? They already spend a lot of time in doctors' offices, in hospitals, et cetera. How do you design your trial to make it easy for them to participate? What can be done at home? Don't bring patients, don't have them drive 3 hours to the major medical center to have their blood drawn. How can you do that in the home? How can you do that in their community? There are lots of solutions for this, and some certainly require some maturation as a solution. There's unevenness in execution, but there are ways to do that. And then the other piece, having spent 25 years in academic medicine, I was a scientist, I still am, I guess, and a physician, and I know what our tendency is when we're designing studies. I've designed lots of studies in my career. We want to ask every question we possibly can and get every piece of data we possibly can get. And that is completely normal for a scientist. But these studies, drug development studies, clinical trials, are focused on two things and two things only: safety of the drug, efficacy of the drug. Everything else is extraneous and adds burden. Now, that doesn't mean you can't study anything else. You can't collect any other data, but you have to consider what's the cost benefit of that? How much burden does it add to the patients? How much complexity does it add to the trial? So these are important considerations when we're talking about urgency. And frankly, for that single asset biotech, this is their first asset, in clinical trials. They don't have the luxury of extraneous.
Yeah, that for sure. And would some of those additional questions be ethical to look at after the go to market, after the approvals are done?
Yeah, so that's a fantastic question. So in many cases, those are things that can be studied later, so either in an open label extension, while you're working through the paperwork with the FDA, or once you've gone to market. Many of these drugs require extended post-approval studies. And especially for neurodegenerative disease, it's unlikely your trial is going to have dramatic outcomes in a 12-month trial, right? I mean, it's very hard to see the signal in that period of time. And with accelerated approval for many drugs, those post-approval studies are even more critical. So yes, in those settings, you can study more things. And again, it comes back to what I said before about the things you don't know. You're going to study those things, but there's also an opportunity to find out the things you don't know. And study those. And so there are opportunities to expand the knowledge around it, and even in collaboration with academia in many cases, with the KOLs. But, when that urgency companies need to be focused on the finish line. Yeah. They need to be focused on what's going to get them across that finish line before they run out of money.
Yeah, for sure. And just to focus even a little tighter, right? We're reading about and seeing, the rise of, N of one therapies, right? And treatments designed for a single patient or a very small cohort of patients. So for our gurus out there listening to this, can you help us to understand why this is such a breakthrough moment in medicine?
Yeah. So, really, you said it, the N of one or N of few. It's very hard to do a classic trial, when your population is one, right? And that requires some creativity that, frankly, scientifically we've had for a while, but the regulatory structures, the regulatory rules are now maturing so that it provides a path to getting these drugs to patients and learning and generalizing from that. So, the classic one would be, say, antisense oligonucleotides. Those are sequence specific. In many cases, they're targeting a rare mutation that affects one individual, maybe a handful. And so you're never really going to be able to you certainly can't do a placebo-controlled trial. You're never really going to be powered to do a trial per se. But what you often will find is that other patients will have mutations nearby or mutations in the same gene, and potentially you can pool those patients together in a trial, a basket trial. And there's some work happening, clinical trials that will be happening soon in the urea cycle disorders, where each gene is its own basket. And, going back to the ASOs, the technology has been around for 20 years. They're actually quite safe. And, we know how to predict safety with very standard in vitro and some in vivo studies. And so you can go into a patient rapidly And so there's a lot of data in patients with these drugs, and the chemistry is all the same. All that changes is that sequence. So where on the RNA or in the DNA, mostly in the RNA, where is it binding? And what is it doing? And it's all very predictable. And so the opportunity to sort of use the class of drug and the process of manufacture as the foundation, and you're just changing the address, the postal address that's put on there. Combining those things together provides a new opportunity. And that's really what N of one has created, is this knowledge base that allows us to start grouping patients together, understanding things based on a proven technology.
Yeah, gotcha. So, and with that, I've noticed, and maybe you can help us here, historically, a lot of centers have been very guarded, right, about their platforms. And now we're seeing academic centers and industry rivals and regulators and advocates all collaborate. And I'm curious if you can help us. What caused this shift? What were the practical aspects that made this possible?
That's been something I've written about and have been looking at for some time. The shift is remarkable. I mean, there is definitely a sense of collaboration and, frankly, urgency out there that hasn't been there before. Academic centers that are normally competitors being willing to work together. And I think at least in this space, the turning point was baby KJ, right? So a whole group of industry and academic stakeholders, each owning a piece of the process, created a personalized treatment and saved a baby's life, right? And of course, it's very public and very out there and very successful. And now the trick is doing it less expensively, more efficiently for more patients. But it's been shown that it could be done. It's sort of like putting a man on the moon, right? You do it once and you show it can be done, and then you get better at it. In many ways, taking that space analogy further, is like SpaceX has done, with their rockets, right? Make a lot of mistakes, break a lot of things, but ultimately end up in a better place than you were. So I think a lot of institutions now see the opportunity here, see that it is feasible to do scientifically. The science has been there, but that they have to work together because they don't have all of the components. They have to work with other academic centers, industry partners, et cetera. And, that's, the IP is always the sticky issue and who pays for what, but people are willing to discuss it for the first time. And there is sharing going on because they see that at the end of the day, if they share their piece of the puzzle, that the returns will come. Mm-hmm. And that sort of brings us to the other piece, which is this discussion. Baby KJ had a very rare disease. And in general, the pharma model has never really embraced those diseases because it's very hard to make your money back, or turn a profit when you have very few patients on the back end. And so what has happened with some of the IP that's out there is, as long as people are treating these ultra rare diseases, the IP is sort of just being quietly shared. We're not going to worry about that if you're treating patients where there's only 100 patients for the disease, because nobody's going to actually license that IP. And so there's been that willingness to sort of look the other way. I mean, I wish there was a more systematized approach to this. It makes me wary whenever there's a system that's based on the goodwill of one or two individuals that may not be there forever, and then what happens? But I do think it's a step in the right direction, and it enables treatments for patients who would otherwise have no options.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And doing my research, I discovered programs like the ARPA-H, Thrive, and pushing new boundaries. So what have you learned about making these public-private partnerships actually function in practice? I mean, you touched on some of the IP, but I think it's probably deeper than that, isn't it?
Yeah. Oh, well, yeah, it's always complicated. The devil's in the details. So I know quite a lot about the efforts involved in putting consortia together for the ARPA-H Thrive program. And it was very interesting to see some of these groups come together that you wouldn't think would work together. And to this day, whether they were funded or not, are still moving forward together. So there's collaboration. It was definitely a catalyst for some of these collaborations, and forced people to think about the system as opposed to their individual silo. So opportunities like that, I think, are incredibly useful. And again, whether the government hands you a bunch of money to actually do what you say you're going to do, or it just opens the doors. There's lots of other funders out there who are very interested in these diseases and very interested in having an impact.
Yeah, let's drill into that for a moment too, because many of our gurus out there that are listening in are med tech and biotech founders, navigating today's capital environments. And in rare disease, we kind of touched on that, where the patient populations are so small and urgency is high. And you talked about a little bit on the runway that these companies have to get the product out there. What best practices have you seen for attracting some of these mission-aligned investors, while still building a financially sustainable company? It sounds like it's a very small needle to thread there.
So traditionally, it would be small. So if you're a biotech or a med tech founder and you're out raising, there's the usual group of VC suspects, right? And the reality is in today's environment, most of the bigger VCs, aren't going to write checks for smaller than $50, $100 million. And so, it's always great to have $100 million lying around, but what do you really need, again, to get to that finish line or to get to the next milestone? What actually is required? And that question, especially in rare, means that you have to look very hard at what it is that you plan to spend the money on. So, the biggest expense traditionally has always been the clinical trial, the clinical trials. But going back to our discussion of trial design, you can design trials very expensively, or you can design them very efficiently, both time and capital efficiency. And my argument to many companies is your trial is just too expensive for the return that you're going to get. Why are you going to do a $100 million trial with all of these patients when you could do a streamlined trial that includes everything through pivotal with 20 patients, do an adaptive design, and maybe then it expands to 30 patients. But all of a sudden, all you need is $25 million, not $100 million. Well, at $25 million, you backed yourself into a corner because those same VCs are not going to write a $25 million check. It's not worth it to them. Mm-hmm. So who's going to write a $25 million check? Well, you've got the smaller groups, the smaller VCs, the investment capital groups, the family offices. There's multiple opportunities for funding that are filling this space. You've got your Reg CFs, your platforms where you crowdfund, family offices, holdcos. There's a lot of companies out there that are buying up these assets or buying the licenses to these assets and then paying for development, resurrecting assets, so to speak. And so finding the right funder is really, so having the right size for your raise and then finding the right funder for that size or group of funders. And they are out there. They're out there and there are more and more of them. The family offices are particularly interested in not just returns, but impact. And, if you can have a 20 or 30 person trial that's done in 12 to 18 months, that turnaround time is very attractive. And they're not necessarily looking for that 10x exit. They're looking for, did we help patients and maybe we made a little money? Fantastic. And they can be more patient.
Yeah, I would think also that structuring the funding that way might help with a lot of credibility, right? I mean, if you're the researcher or the founder of the company, and you can go, hey, we've got this really nice and tight, and our ask is much more modest, if you will. If 25 million is modest, here's the parameters. I would think that would help. Is that what you're seeing?
Well, absolutely. And I've seen, I've worked with companies where we've downsized their trial and decomplexed it to the point where it's cost between 5 and 10 million to do an entire decent phase 2 trial. So, this model of spending $100 million on a trial, it really doesn't make much sense for certainly these ultra rare conditions. And that's most of the rare conditions.
Yeah. Right. Gotcha. And circling back a bit, based on this and that trial design, if I've got this right, umbrella studies and platform trials are emerging as new development models. So what lessons have you learned about compressing these timelines without compressing the rigor and still staying within that budget?
Yeah. So especially some of the companies I work with, they have, for example, multiple ASOs targeting neurodevelopmental disorders, genetic neurodevelopmental disorders. And, there could be multiple ASOs even within the same gene. And ultimately, the phenotypes of these disorders are somewhat similar enough that you can have a master protocol that applies to all of them. And maybe there's some tweaks here and there. But what that does is that if you can get that into the FDA, then you can start adding baskets to your umbrella. You've got an umbrella with a master protocol, and then you're putting different genes that fit that master protocol as a basket under that umbrella. And that's what's emerging as a viable path forward. It allows you to get multiple assets through without having to do full INDs on each and every one. Process approval, when it comes to full fruition, will help a ton, where the FDA approves the process, and then you're just changing like I said before, changing the postal address on the molecule, just saying, hey, we're going to make it go here instead of there, and so it allows you to streamline your IND enabling stuff and not have to do so much paperwork, de novo, and frankly helps the FDA with their throughput, gets these things into patients where frankly, that's where we need to study these drugs. Patients want to take some risk because the potential for reward is substantial and they don't have other options, and time is lives. Mm-hmm. And so allowing them to do that and not forcing companies to cure a fake disease in a mouse, which we know means little to nothing about how a drug's going to behave in a human. Those are important steps, and those are coming. Nothing changes overnight, but those things are absolutely on the way. And, the FDA wants the industry to talk to them, collaborate with them, propose new models. I'm firmly of the belief that some of the vagueness in the FDA guidance over the last year is because they want the industry to propose, to say how are we going to do this? Here's the goal, but how are we going to get there? What's the best way to get there? And honestly, I think, purposeful or not, I think that's the right approach. Let us experiment with the experiment.
Yeah. And kind of ties into that earlier statement we had about getting that first study done and through and getting that drug on the market, and then doing that follow-on to bring maybe a different
continue to learn.
Yeah, for Absolutely. Sure. Yeah, that's very helpful. And, Rob, I find this really exciting, this whole conversation, right? Because this rare disease, we're kind of talking about, it's building the blueprint for truly personalized medicine. So what structural lessons should, some of the bigger med techs or biotech, ecosystems be paying attention to right now?
Yeah. So, sort of taking a step back and looking at the big picture, there's a couple of things going on. The first thing is that, we've known for a while, but now we really can tell that basically every disease is rare. Every disease is an N of 1. Even when there's 5 patients with the disease, each one is an N of 1. right? And our ability to do genetic sequencing and understanding the variations, not just the mutations, but the variations and how those affect disease are critical. And, cancer is doing this very effectively and has been for quite a while, using molecular markers to define different cancer subtypes and define best treatment options. So this broad idea of personalized medicine is absolutely coming to the fore. Now, I often say to people that we've been doing this for a while. We just have better tools. If I see a patient with hypertension, for example, based on certain data, race and weight and various other laboratory values, I might choose one drug over another because the data say that's better. So we already subdivide patients based on characteristics outside of genetics. Now we have the ability, and epigenetics, and now our ability to subdivide them further to find the best approach for each patient is less guesswork than it was. And that's really important. And I think that's a trend that's going to continue. We're going to get better and better at understanding these basic elements of biology and how they relate to the effect of a device or the effect of a drug. And everything will be personalized medicine. So, for founders working in this space, I think they need to be thinking about that. Certainly if you've got, a device for, to help someone with their breathing, I'm just choosing some random example. You're generally going to set it, have it structured towards the average patient that you're helping, right? But that means when we do that, that means that half the patients are being overtreated and half are being undertreated. Right. And so you're probably going to be effective in some window around that median. But, and from a business perspective, that's probably the right choice. But if the data exists to break those, to subcategorize those, how does that change your design? Whether it's a device or a drug, how does that change how you're targeting, how you're designing your intervention? And depending on the intervention, it's going to be different in each case. But I think founders need to think about that because the data are going to come and a one size fits all isn't going to fit all, not forever.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And Rob, I'm kind of curious, right? You've got deep experience in this area. And from your vantage point, today, as you advise companies, what execution mistakes, or maybe to put a positive spin on it, what execution opportunities do you see that, most often derail some of these companies or delay them in getting their rare disease programs established?
There's so I would say the most common one, the common mistake that people make, and it's very expected and understandable. If you're a founder of a startup company, you're just trying to get to the next raise. And so your focus is on whatever milestone is going to get you to the next raise. And you're going to try to be as efficient as you can with your capital in the meantime. And all of that, it makes perfect sense. But what it does is it creates islands in your process. And you jump from one island to the next island if you meet your milestones and you're successful, and you keep jumping islands. But you're going to find yourself on an island where you don't have the tools for that island. And what often happens, as an example, and probably one of the most common, is that companies get themselves up against approval. Congratulations, you're almost there. They haven't talked to anybody commercial. So they have not thought about formulation. What's the effect of formulation on the commercialization of the drug? Are patients going to want it? If you've got patients who are all on G-tubes because of their disease, gosh, wouldn't it be better if this was a liquid than a pill? Just an example. They haven't talked the commercial, because they haven't talked to commercial, they haven't talked to payers. Just because you get approved doesn't mean anybody's going to pay for the drug. What's your pricing?
Yeah.
How is Medicaid going to cover it? All of these conversations should have been happening to some degree all along the developmental plan. And so I tell I tell companies as soon as you're starting phase 1, you need to start talking to commercial people. What are the things we need to know now? What do we need to know at phase 2? What do we need to know at phase 3? Assuming that you're doing all 3 of those phases. In a streamlined trial, you got to move quicker. But that's an example where people are just survival. It's Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Like, we don't have the luxury to think about commercial right now because we're just focused on keeping the company alive, keeping the lights on. Mm-hmm. So I see a lot of that. And it's not just commercial. There's other aspects to this, right, where it's just, you've got the blinders on, and understandably so, but that's not how to play the long game.
Yeah, I love that. We often talk on this podcast about FDA authorization does not equate to commercial adoption, right? And I love that. You got to be thinking and looking a little further down the road, right, to know where some of those hazards might be.
And you need to know where, especially in rare, you need to know where the patients are in the rest of the world and what their regulatory and commercial setups are, mm-hmm, and how that's going to impact the commercialization of your drug or your device.
Yeah, I love it. So, Rob, first of all, I want to thank you and acknowledge you for the time and information you provided as our guru today. If somebody wants to learn more about you and your services, how do we do that? Can we find you on a website? Do you have a LinkedIn? How do we learn more?
LinkedIn is the best way. Just search my name, Rob Freishtat, Freishtat, and I'll pop up and send me a message.
Well, that's fantastic. So, Rob, once again, I really enjoyed our conversation. We appreciate all the insights you provided us today, and thank you for being our guru.
Absolutely my pleasure, Tom.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to MedTech Gurus. I am Sylvester Harris, your MC. If you want to learn more about Tom and his consulting services, you can go to www.pctmedical.com or email Tom at tom@pctmedical.com. Now, I can be reached at Sylvester Harris, that's SylvesterHarris 5048@gmail.com, and I'd be pleased to discuss any voiceover work that you may want for your company or broadcast. Hey, thanks so much for listening, and catch us on the next episode of MedTech Gurus.